робить? Диви, що робить? Б'є!
Б'є машину нам, ЦКшник. Не кричи, доця. ЦКшник вискакує з машини, коли поліція зупиняється з поліцейською. І прямо б'є нам машину, і рідне вікно ламає.
Скажи, я на дитячий мір стараюсь. Ой, вон Вадим, це Вадим був. Так, все, лежи трубку, не сиди, знімаєш потім. Провірте, чи заблоковані двері. Тише, нічого не цей.
Номер машини читай. 1808.
Що таке? П'яний, що ти робиш? Що ти робиш? Вадим! Вадим, они все пьяные! Они пьяные! Пьяные! Пьяные, алкаши!
Водила от Бога.
Бля! Будем жить!
Despite renewed diplomatic efforts to initiate a peace process, the intensity of combat on the Ukrainian fronts remains undiminished. The Pokrovsk urban agglomeration is still one of the most fiercely contested battlefields. The nature of the fighting, characterized by Russian tactics employing small assault groups in a strategy of total infiltration deep into Ukrainian defensive positions, has made it difficult to delineate clear front lines or zones of control. According to Russian media South Front Press, this ambiguity is actively exploited by Kiev's propaganda units, which frequently announce media victories that often bear little resemblance to the situation on the ground. In reality, they say, the position of the Ukrainian army in this sector remains increasingly precarious. The recent breakthrough of Russian army units on the northern flank in the Dobropilya area triggered a swift and desperate response from the Ukrainian command. Kiev was forced to urgently redeploy its reserves to this critical direction, including fighters from the widely publicized Azov unit of the National Guard, in a clear attempt to present some semblance of a victory on the front, while the president was abroad pleading for weapons in Washington. These Azov militants, alongside other units, launched counterattacks. Over the past 5 days, Ukrainian forces have made repeated attempts to counterattack in the area of the settlement of Zoloty Kolodez. The first corps of the Azov, a unit often noted for being more effective in social media than on the battlefield, according to some Russian sources, committed tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, motorized groups, and pickup trucks to this enterprise. Despite initial setbacks, however, by massing reserves and persisting with small group tactics, the Ukrainians managed to push Russian units back from a section of the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk highway. As of now, Ukrainian forces have re-established physical control over this previously lost segment of the strategically important road. However, the road remains under partial fire control from the Russian army, meaning any movement is perilous and the tactical gain is limited. As at the 19th of August, Ukrainian groups were concentrated in Zoloty Kolodez and Vesely and continue to funnel additional reserves into these areas. Over the past few days, the armed forces of Ukraine have reportedly pulled up to 2 regiments' worth of forces toward the towns of Dobropilya and Rodinsky. In response to this Ukrainian reinforcement, Russian assault groups that had earlier made a thrust towards Zoloty Kolodez have regrouped. Following Ukrainian counterattacks, the front line has shifted along the northern salient toward Kucherov Yar. Here, Russian units are firmly holding defensive positions on key heights. This area is acquiring critical importance as control over these high grounds allows Russian forces to constrain further Ukrainian advances and provides cover for maneuver on adjacent operational directions. The current phase is characterized by the formation of a stable line of contact, the fortification of captured positions, and the saturation of the area with forces in preparation for subsequent assault. To the north of Pokrovsk, heavy fighting is ongoing around the Rodinsky mine. Russian forces are engaged in a painstaking clearance of the area's buildings, a task made exceedingly difficult by the strong Ukrainian fortifications. On the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk itself, the fighting remains devastating. With each passing day, it becomes more difficult for the Ukrainian garrison to deliver ammunition. Over a couple of days alone, approximately 15 units of various Ukrainian military vehicles have been destroyed. Ukrainian forces are now forced to break through into Pokrovsk, highlighting the severe logistical problems they are facing, as such tactics in a contested urban environment often lead to significant losses. The battle for the northern flank remains a fluid and brutal contest of wills, where small-scale tactical gains are traded at a high cost. And amidst this drama on the battlefield, another war was being fought on the information front. Within the past 24 hours, major news spread across social media about 1.7 million Ukrainian soldiers being dead based on a digital card index acquired by Russian hacker groups from Ukraine's Chief of Staff, which has provided details on dead or missing personnel, including their names, details of their deaths, and personal data of their families. The news has been picked up on various media platforms like EA Daily, The Economic Times, and Military Watch magazine. Ukrainian sources, of course, deny it. So today's video will focus on coverage of the Pokrovsk and Pablka fronts for this past week. It will focus on the Ukrainian counterattack in the Dnipropetrovsk area, as well as a growing crisis for Ukraine south of Pablka near the Huliapole area, where even Ukrainian sources describe it as a situation that may become even more threatening than Pokrovsk. Then I will dive into the reports that reveal the extent of Ukraine's losses as well as their current demographic crisis. All that I ask is you continue to assist in keeping the show running with super thanks or PayPal donations, and stick around to the end for bonus footage, and make sure to watch the membership video introduction in the end screen. But let's get into it. After the Russians carried out a swift and adventurous 17-kilometer breakthrough near Dobropilya and occupied part of the newly built defense line in the area of the villages of Zoloty, Kolodez, and Rubizny, the armed forces of Ukraine were forced to respond quickly. Within a few days, Ukrainian troops cut the salient in the area of Vilny, recaptured Rodinsky and Nikhanorivka, and continued the offensive from there toward Mayak. From the other flank, from Vlodomirivka, the defense forces entered Mayak and established positions in its northern part, thus maximally narrowing the supply road. Without proper support, the Russian armed forces offensive had to retreat, and the Ukrainian army regained Rubizny, Zoloty, Kolodez, Vesely, and Ruski. According to Ukrainian sources, in Counterattack, the Russians found themselves encircled and began retreating south from the village. However, the Russians also understood the necessity of supporting offensive and threw additional reserves to help from the east to remove the threat of encirclement. In recent days of fierce counter-battles, the Russian armed forces again expanded their wedge between Likhanovka and Chakove, and also prevented the encirclement of troops in Counterattack. In addition, the Russian army is advancing on Vlodomirivka and trying to occupy Rusin Yar to maximally expand the wedge zone. Time has come down to days that will decide not only the situation on this section of the front, but also the further fate of Dobropilya, Pokrovsk, and even Konstantinivka. If the Russians can establish themselves here, the cities will be in great danger of capture. If the Ukrainian armed forces still manage to cut off the Russian salient near Dobropilya, then the Russian leadership will return to the priority encirclement of Pokrovsk through the conquest of Rodinsky. While the Russians were distracted by the offensive to the north, the Ukrainian forces were able to recapture part of the road north of Rodinsky and partially removed the threat of taking the village in pincers. Meanwhile, the Russian troops are conducting battles on the northern outskirts of Rodinsky and also attacking Chervony Liman, so far without much success. However, taking advantage of the fact that the defense forces transferred part of the reserves to Dobropilya, the Russians stormed the outskirts of Myrnograd from the direction of Rodivka. Here they managed to break through 2 kilometers to the village of Prumin. From the southwestern flank, the Russians are still attacking Virovi, while the defense forces, who previously expelled enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups from Leonotovichi and Pokrovsk itself, are conducting counterattacks. The Ukrainian armed forces are also attempting to repel the offensive by the Russians attempting to drive a wedge between Udachny and Molodetsky in order to resume the western encirclement of Pokrovsk, an effort they abandoned half a year ago. Now near Pablka itself, the front has held almost unshakably for nearly a month. The Russian forces are not rushing to storm the Ukrainian powerful fortified area head-on. They, as always, want to use the strategy of flanking maneuvers. To bypass the settlement from the north, they need to cross the Solona River, but it now serves well as a defensive line for both Novopavlivka and Pokrovsk. The only thing the Russians have managed to do here in several weeks is occupy two fields near Muravka. From the south, the Russians are restrained by the Vovcha River. Here they finally occupied Oleksivka after half a year of fighting, but could not overcome Ukrainian defense near Dachny. Therefore, they take positions along the river and look for weak points to cross it. In recent days, they approached the shore in the area of the village of Filia. However, the further south, the more fragile Ukrainian defense becomes. Overall, the Novopavlivka direction has the worst dynamics of Russian advancement from 5 to 9 square kilometers per day. And what's worse, the Russian troops are advancing along a fairly wide front of 40 kilometers, from Zeleny High south of Novopavlivka to Malinivka, which is near Huliapole in Zaporizhia. Having advanced near Zeleny High, the Russians managed to surprise Andriivka Klevtsova, but the defense forces pushed them out of the village with some losses. In the area of Voskresenka and Pedubny, the defense forces continued to hold part of their positions, but the Russian army, bypassing them, is trying to break through further into the Dnepropetrovsk region. They have advanced between Voskresenka and Malivka and are also preparing to attack Chivneve. Both villages are already located outside the Donetsk region. Even further south, the Russians completely captured Vilny Pole and broke through 4 kilometers to the west and began storming Komi Shubaka. It is here between Komi Shubaka and Temirivka that there is a junction of 3 regions, Donetsk, Dnepropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia, and the Russians have already captured this conditional 3-way border. After the occupation of Temirivka, the Russians expanded their activity even further south, where they wanted to create a threat of encircling Huliapole from the north. Particularly in the area of Poltavka, the Russian armed forces are advancing from 2 flanks, conducting battles from Malinivka and also advancing on a 5-kilometer front near Pohisky. Currently, the defense forces cannot find countermeasures and stabilize the front, which supposedly should have been ready for defense long ago, but as it turned out, as weak defense lines in certain sections and troops unprepared for defense. Probably in the coming weeks, this direction may become even more threatening than Pokrovsk.
К нашему вопросу, сегодня в списках пропавших без вести более миллиона людей, и, конечно же, эти люди, скорее всего, погибшие.
Now, leaked military files have confirmed that the Ukrainian armed forces have lost more than 1.7 million troops, including both those killed and missing since the outbreak of the full-scale hostilities between the country and Russia in February of 2022.
Ich befinde mich gerade in Bryansk. Hinter mir befinden sich 5 Kohltransporter mit Toten.
A digital card index acquired by hacker groups from Ukraine's Chief of Staff has provided details on dead or missing personnel, including their names, details of their deaths, and personal data of their families. The information indicates that 118,500 personnel were killed or went missing in 2022, 405,400 in 2023, 595,000 in 2024, and 621,000 so far in 2025, which corroborates with a growing body of evidence which has emerged over more than 3 years that attrition rates have increased tremendously and unsustainably. Commenting on the information, Ukrainian Member of Parliament Artem Dimitak reported, in quotations, "The lists of the missing today contain more than 1 million people, and of course these people are most likely dead, while their families remain in complete ignorance. The situation is tragic. The situation is frightening." Several Ukrainian sources, such as Ukrinform and one called the Center for Countering Disinformation, have been quick to characterize the report as fake or absurdly fake, as one stated. However, several credible sources, such as the Economic Times, Military Watch magazine, and EA Daily, have carried the story. Elaborating on the extent of the manpower losses Ukraine has suffered, Dimitak lamented that villages have been emptied of men, including the conscription of the elderly and disabled, and that as a result of the huge losses of personnel Ukraine is facing and a demographic crisis, we have lost several generations, he said. His statement coincides with a call by lawmaker Alexei Goncharenko to recruit foreign fighters to fight Ukraine's war effort as a means of addressing the increasingly extreme personnel shortages the country has suffered. Ukrainian conscript units has suffered extreme casualty rates at times approaching 80 to 90%, with the Wall Street Journal being among the sources to report that the Ukrainian army has relied on recruiting poor men from villages and sending them to the front lines with just 2 days of training. The life expectancy for personnel on high-intensity frontiers has at times been as low as just 4 hours, according to reports from Western observers on the ground. In April of 2023, Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom, Vadim Pristaiko, revealed that Kiev was concealing the full number of casualties suffered in the war, stating that it has been our policy from the start not to discuss our losses, but that when the war is over, we will acknowledge this. I think it will be a horrible number. Multiple Western sources have since that time continued to widely report on the extreme casualty rates suffered by Ukrainian conscript units, highlighting the lack of training they have had, which has contributed to major losses. The Ukrainian army and supporting foreign units took particularly high casualties during an incursion into the Russian Kursk region from August 2024, during which forces were surrounded by Russian and supporting North Korean forces from multiple sides and subjected to intensified air attack, very often over open ground with little to no cover from air defense systems. The isolation and neutralization of tens of thousands of personnel in Kursk has since placed the Russian army in a much stronger position to gain ground across multiple fronts, both in disputed territories and in territories that Russia continued to recognize as Ukrainian. The unsustainability of the Ukrainian position has fueled a consensus that Russia's negotiating position for a ceasefire to end the conflict has become increasingly favorable, in the knowledge that the longer the war continues, the greater its military standing will be relative to its smaller neighbor, and the more Ukraine's front lines will face the possibility of near total collapse. Multiple sources have attested to the disastrous situation on the front lines in Ukraine, with former Chief of Staff of the Ukrainian Army's elite Azov Brigade, Lieutenant Colonel Bogdan Kotovich, having in early August detailed an increasingly catastrophic situation facing Ukrainian forces in the disputed Donbas regions.